Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Panel Fit Monthly Chat. Today, we are here with Carissa Véliz, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and Institute of Ethics in AI, and a tutorial fellow at Hertford College at the University of Oxford. She works on digital ethics, practical ethics in general, political philosophy, public policy. And she is the author of Privacy is Power, which is the book we will comment today. It will be our starting point to touch some different subjects of privacy, data protection, etc. So welcome, Carissa.
Thank you, Federico.
Okay, let's start right away with the first question. When we talk about these issues, my feeling is like we are in a bubble of people already somehow aware of the importance of privacy. Book like yours that together with a philosophical and ethical approach includes a practical how-to advice could be a useful tool to make people care more for their data. This is my opinion, humble opinion. So how do you think we could gather a broader audience around these topics?
Well, I try to write a book that is short, that is very accessible, that is grounded, that tells stories exactly about how data works and why it's dangerous. So I try to write the kind of book that anybody would be interested in. Anyone who carries a smartphone or uses a laptop. And my hope is that those of us who are already worried about it can read it and then recommend it and give it to those of us who think we're not worried about it. Because one of the things about privacy is that, and I argue this in the book, that even the people who think they don't care about it really actually do care about it. And we have many symptoms of that, from people not giving out their passwords to nobody wanting to be the victim of identity theft. So if you have that kind of friend who's the typical friend who uploads pictures without asking you first, and who's shared messages and that kind of thing, or who is very sloppy about their own personal cybersecurity, it's the kind of book that I hope you can give to your friends. I can't hear you, Federico. Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted my microphone. You're right. So it's a book intended, you mean for the general audience?
Yeah, I think I put things there for experts. I think experts can also enjoy it because it has some philosophical ideas and some analogies that are quite innovative, like the idea that we should think about personal data as toxic, or some of the reflections I have on power and how we should think about power like energy and how it transforms from one kind into another, and why this kind of new power that arises with personal data is important. So I think it's also for experts, but it's written in a way that you can know absolutely nothing about privacy and absolutely nothing about personal data and understand perfectly and enjoy it, I hope.
Yeah, I really appreciated also the explanation, let's say the connections also with historical and philosophical general issues that are beyond the technological field that sometimes is automatically linked to such topics. So.
Yeah, I think a good theory of privacy should be able to connect with ages before the internet, because privacy has been a worry for a long time, and it's very much connected to our worries today. It's just that it's manifesting in different ways.
Yeah, and just to go deeper on a specific case, after 2 years of investigation, as Isabella Kaminska puts it on the Financial Times, it looks like Cambridge Analytica's main data-related crime was overselling its own capabilities rather than actually hacking democracy with the help of the Russians. This is a rough summary of a very well-known issue. So I guess the way these issues are often covered on the media with emotional titles and wordings are confusing for the audience. Should journalism make a general reflection on how such topics are addressed?
Yeah, definitely. I think, but part of the reason why journalism has this desire and this need to be very alarming is because they're part of the data economy, because everybody's part of the data economy. So they have to engage readers and they have to make readers share and for things to become viral. It's the same kind of logic of this perverse system that we're in of the data economy. So that's one thing. But yeah, definitely journalists should be as precise as possible. However, I think that this conclusion is absolutely wrong. It's absolutely misleading. It's actually one of the cases of journalists just like being too shallow on something. And there are many reasons why this conclusion is too shallow. One thing is Cambridge Analytica tried to thwart democracy. Whether it achieved that or not is a different question. But for example, we still think it's scandalous for somebody to try to kill someone, even if they fail, right? So, I mean, this is just as scandalous as we thought it was. That's one thing. Another thing is that the ICO report has a lot of lacunes, and some of them are quite disappointing. One of them is that it doesn't say that Cambridge Analytica didn't have ties to Russians. It just says that that was beyond their remit. So basically, there hasn't been an investigation on that, and therefore we're still not sure to what extent that is worrying. Another thing that the ICO report fails to mention is how it gives the impression that Cambridge Analytica had nothing to do with the Brexit referendum, whereas there's very good evidence that a subsidiary of Cambridge Analytica that was Canadian and called AIQ, Aggregate IQ, did in fact work on winning the Vote Leave campaign. And so that's a huge kind of missing piece of the puzzle. Furthermore, whereas it might be true that, and it's actually probably true, that Cambridge Analytica tried to oversell the kind of effect it could have, really, you don't have to have a big effect on a very big population to be able to sway elections. Many elections are lost and won on the basis of a few hundreds of votes.
Yeah, I sometimes I feel like it's very biased, the way such issues are covered. Like if one starts thinking about, okay, this is the importance of such data leaks or breaches are overrated. So let's write a story that says this based on what on the findings I can find. And on the other side, there are sometimes too much apocalyptical views of these issues. So as I said, the wording and the choices that newspapers make about titles are somehow misleading. Like they fail to help people understand the issue. They sometimes aim at trigger an emotion, like okay, stay safe, nothing happened, or be aware they are stealing our freedom as a whole. So I think your book and the way you frame the issue is interesting because it helps us understand exactly the scope of the problem of the issue. And you write, and I totally agree, that much like saving the ozone layer, reforming the data economy requires regulation. But data protection authorities often struggle to cope with the loads of work they are demanded. Is there an excessive gap between the scope of regulations and the actual possibilities of the authorities that should investigate and enforce fines?
Yeah, most definitely. Currently, data protection authorities are understaffed, they're underfunded, and they can only really go after a few cases for a few companies. And the kind of breaches that are happening of the GDPR are immense, in both in terms of scope, but also just how many of them happen every day. So definitely we need to address that problem. Part of the regulations that I propose would help that, because at the moment the default is still data collection, and then things like the GDPR mostly focus on how we use data. Whereas if we switch that to make the default non-data collection, there would be a lot less personal data sloshing around, and a lot less that could go wrong, and a lot less to police. So partly we need a better system as well. For instance, I think it's very clear for everyone who uses the internet that the consent system is broken, that just doesn't work at all. It creates a lot of headaches for individuals, but also for companies and for data protection agencies. So we need to change that as well. So partly it's a matter of changing regulation to make it easier to police and to make there less of personal data sloshing around. And part of it is getting our priorities right and funding the agencies properly so that they can do their jobs properly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Project Panelfit that I represent is also producing some reports and documents around one of the issues that you raised, which is informed consent, and to try to understand if it is the right legal form of asking for consent to people to the use of their data. So it's definitely an issue on the consent fatigue you mentioned earlier. So the last question that I like to address you before opening the floor for a question for from the audience is about the collective concept of privacy that you mention in your book. So you write, privacy is collective in at least two ways. It's not only that your privacy slips can facilitate violations of the right to privacy of other people, it's also that the consequences of losses of privacy are experienced collectively. So this completely changes the way we think about the possibility for the individual to sell his or her data like it was a commodity. Could you tell us more about this, and again, why we should raise awareness on this?
Yeah, thank you. So there are many misunderstandings around privacy, I think. And one of them is that privacy is this individual thing, it's personal, and it's just up to you whether you have a personal preference for privacy or not. And in the book, I argue this is completely wrong. In fact, privacy is first and foremost a collective concern and a political concern, and it always has been. And one of the reasons is that our personal data is not really personal in the way that it's named. It's kind of a misleading name in some ways. So for instance, if I share my genetic data, I'm sharing data about my brothers and my sisters and my parents and my kids, and even very distant kin for whom it can have consequences for insurance, for discrimination, for police enforcement, all kinds of consequences. In the same way, if I share data about my location, I'm sharing data about my neighbors as well, about my coworkers. If I share data even about my psychology, I am sharing data about people like me who share those psychological traits. So really, we are intertwined in a way that makes us vulnerable to each other's privacy. And so privacy is both a collective concern, but also a collective endeavor in that we need to protect each other's privacy. And that's one of the reasons why, for instance, tech companies typically want to have access to your contacts, because you are a node in a network. You're somebody's friend, you're somebody's sister or brother, or somebody's neighbor, or somebody's lawyer. And through you, they can get to other people. So that's the one aspect in which privacy is collective. The other one is that the effects of privacy losses are felt by everyone. So in the case of Cambridge Analytica or similar, there are similar political firms that are trying to do the same thing. When they use our data to try to come up with voters' profiles to target them and then sway elections, for instance, it's very clear that the Trump campaign tried to discourage Black voters from going to vote. that hurts the whole country in a way, and in more indirectly the whole world, because if it hurts elections for a country, there are doubts about the legitimacy of that government, and the fact that that government is in power has effects for the whole country, but also for the whole world in terms of foreign politics. Like Brexit is going to affect the UK mostly, of course, but also Europe and the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's a collective issue in many senses. So, okay, it's time for questions from the audience. So, if anyone wants to address his or her question to Carissa, now is the moment. Just unmute yourself and speak loud. I see some names that I know. Jose wants to speak. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, Carissa, for your reflections. I was so happy to be able to ask you something. For sure you know the report by IDC on the data economy. They prepare reports every year telling how the data economy is growing, and I was asking how it would be possible to eliminate data economy when it has shown to be so powerful and so strong in 5-6 years. It wouldn't be better to maybe trying to regulate that in order to achieve feasible results?
In some ways, my proposal seems very radical, to end the data economy. In other ways, it's not as radical, because I'm not arguing that we shouldn't use data. I'm just arguing that we shouldn't buy and sell it. As long as personal data is for sale, there will be misuses. First, there will be an incentive for collecting more data than is necessary, and then there will be an incentive for selling it no matter what. So one very clear instance is now with the coronavirus pandemic, it turns out, for instance, that in the UK, the data that has been used in restaurants and pubs to record who's there for the purposes of track and trace, which supposedly was the only purpose that data could be used for, now has been sold on. And why does this happen? It just happens because we have the wrong incentives in place. We have the wrong system in place. So I understand how it could seem like, well, it's too idealistic. This system creates so much money that we're just never going to go out of it. But in fact, when we look at history, there have been times that we did get rid of things that were incredibly profitable. One example that's not as big, but it's still a relevant example, is CFCs and the ozone layer. When we realized it was just too toxic, we got rid of them, and that incentivized companies to come up with alternatives. In the same way, you can think about child labor or many of the rights that we now have for workers. During the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, people would have said, it's just economically unfeasible to give rights to workers, to allow them only 8-hour shifts and weekends, and this kind of thing that now we think is minimal standards, and that the other things were really barbaric. So in the same way, even though the fact that it seems radical is just because we are in a status quo that is itself very radical. So what I argue is that it's not radical to end the data economy. What's extreme and radical is to have an economic system and a business model that depends on the systematic and mass violation of rights. That's what's crazy.
Thank you, Carissa, and thank you, Jose. Maybe we have time for one more question. If someone wants to join us in the discussion. Okay. Yeah, so I guess that's all for today. So thank you very much, Carissa. It was very interesting. I hope we can stay in contact in the future, also to share the respective findings of our researchers. And thank you very much to everyone who was with us during this discussion, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Federico, and thanks everyone. It's been a real pleasure. And I hope you read the book and tell me what you think.